The office didn't exist. No phones rang. No lights burned late into the night. And yet, somewhere between international ledgers and offshore bank transfers, a company that barely existed was reshaping entire economies. Billions of dollars moved through invisible channels, leaving governments and citizens only fragments of a story incomplete, alarming, and profoundly consequential. At first, it seemed like routine investment. Profits appeared on spreadsheets. Audits passed with barely a glance. International investors nodded in approval. But the money rarely lingered. It flowed in, then exited through a web of fees, royalties, and legal maneuvers so complex they resisted understanding. By the time alarm bells rang, public trust had eroded, currencies wobbled, and infrastructure projects halted mid-construction. Across Europe, analysts frowned at the anomalies. In Washington, policy briefings grew tense. In Asia, fund managers quietly adjusted positions, sensing instability hidden beneath apparent prosperity. For citizens in Latin America, the consequences were tangible: postponed healthcare upgrades, jobs that never materialized, and a growing question whispered in markets and kitchens alike who really controlled the money. And globally, one question emerged: if this could happen here, could it happen anywhere? Could a legal company drain nations without breaking a single law? Could wealth vanish without trace, leaving only consequences behind? If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover hidden global truths. And tell us, where are you watching from? This is the story of the ghost company and the fragile system that allowed it to thrive. The first signs were subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. Spreadsheets in ministries across Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Santiago began to glow with figures that looked promising. Foreign investment was flowing again, corporate profits were rising, and for governments long scarred by inflation and debt, the numbers seemed miraculous. Stability had returned, or so it appeared. Yet beneath the calm, something felt off. The companies reporting extraordinary gains weren't expanding their operations. No new factories rose on the outskirts of cities. Hiring barely increased. Productivity was static. The wealth existed, but only on paper. It hovered, intangible and transient, like smoke slipping through fingers. These firms shared a peculiar anatomy. They were registered locally but owned abroad, often through layers of subsidiaries stretching across offshore jurisdictions. Their revenues entered the economy as investment but exited as consulting fees, royalties, or internal loans. Each transaction complied with international accounting standards. Each drained capital that could have fueled growth and development. Regulators welcomed them at first. Latin America had long sought foreign investment, and here it arrived clean, legal, and profitable. Budgets were adjusted to reflect the inflow. Infrastructure projects were planned with optimism. Few dared to question the system while it seemed to work. Across the Atlantic, banks processed the transfers without hesitation. Law firms in New York refined the structures, marketing them as sophisticated and efficient. Analysts praised the ingenuity. Yet the more elegant the system appeared, the deeper the unseen extraction ran. And then a question began to haunt the corridors of central banks. If this wealth never truly anchored itself in the economy, what would happen when it left? The unease grew as the pattern became undeniable. Economists in Brazil, Chile, and Mexico began comparing notes. Different countries, different industries, yet the same anomaly appeared. Capital arrived, profits were recorded, and yet reserves thinned. Corporate taxes were paid, but public budgets felt stretched. Growth was visible, resilience invisible. In Brasilia, a senior analyst described it as prosperity without gravity. Money came in, lingered just long enough to be counted, and then left. In Buenos Aires, policymakers quietly revised forecasts, aware that the public could not understand the discrepancy. In Lima, infrastructure projects stalled as financial assumptions quietly unraveled. International observers started noticing too. Compliance teams in London flagged rising profit repatriation ratios. In Frankfurt, regulators saw the same entities generating outsized returns with minimal operational footprint. In Washington, officials realized that no laws had been broken, the system was functioning exactly as designed. There were no bribes, no shadowy executives, no corporate scandals. The ghost company had no factory gates, no employees to summon. Its influence flowed through contracts, treaties, and accounting norms written far from the communities feeling the consequences. Citizens began to notice the effects. Hospitals postponed upgrades. Public transport expansions froze mid-construction. Jobs tied to foreign-backed projects quietly disappeared. Something vital had been taken, yet no one could point to the thief. As global investors began to whisper questions, the fragile illusion of stability finally started to crack. The consequences were about to spill far beyond Latin America. The crisis did not arrive with sirens or breaking headlines. It unfolded quietly, like a shadow moving across city streets at dusk, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Bond yields across Latin America began climbing. Insurance premiums nudged higher. Traders in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Zurich noticed patterns in unrelated markets and whispered questions they could not yet answer. In European boardrooms, long-held assumptions faltered. Latin American markets appeared stable, yet liquidity was vanishing. Profits were reported, yet reinvestment stalled. One analyst in Paris described it as financially present, but economically absent. Charts suggested growth. The reality hinted at decay. Governments felt the strain in nuanced ways first. In Chile, public spending was delayed to maintain credibility with international lenders. In Peru and Argentina, emergency financing discussions began months earlier than expected. Citizens noticed tightening first-hand loans harder to secure, jobs quietly disappearing, public projects frozen. With no single culprit, frustration spread like a quiet fire. Media coverage remained cautious, framing the story as regional mismanagement. Behind closed doors, central banks shared confidential memos that revealed a far darker picture. Capital was not fleeing in panic. It was being methodically extracted through contracts, treaties, and offshore arrangements structured years earlier. Then came the unnerving revelation. Some of the largest profit-generating firms could vanish overnight without affecting their parent companies at all. The economic pulse of entire nations had been hollowed, and no one could immediately measure how deep the damage ran. As the extraction continued, the world began to notice in subtle, unnerving ways. International investors saw Latin American markets wobble despite strong headlines. Analysts in London and Frankfurt exchanged quiet glances over charts that didn't match reality. In Tokyo and Singapore, fund managers recalculated exposure, sensing that profits were hollow and liquidity thin. To the outside world, stability remained intact. Behind the scenes, tension mounted. Governments scrambled to respond. In Argentina, the central bank tightened monetary policy while simultaneously negotiating emergency credit lines with international lenders. In Brazil, infrastructure contracts were reviewed mid-flight, as auditors discovered that payments for services had quietly migrated offshore. Citizens felt the pinch, salaries stagnated, projects delayed, and public optimism faded. Confidence, once a steady companion, began to slip. Even seasoned economists were unsettled. The mechanisms driving the crisis were legal, sophisticated, and global. There was no scandal, no dramatic collapse. Instead, a network of subsidiaries, contracts, and financial vehicles systematically removed liquidity from economies that needed it most. The ghost company had no face, no name that mattered locally, yet its reach was undeniable. And as officials debated containment, a new realization took hold: the extraction was not random. It followed a precise design, exploiting the gaps in oversight, law, and international coordination. If left unchecked, this silent collapse could ripple beyond borders, quietly reshaping markets far from Latin America. The question hung in the air, unspoken but urgent: how long before the invisible collapse became unmistakably visible to the world? By the time the full scope became apparent, the human impact was undeniable. Hospitals ran with outdated equipment, schools delayed essential programs, and communities once promised investment now waited in quiet frustration. The ghost company's profits had flowed elsewhere, leaving behind erosion that no headline could capture. Citizens confronted an economy that seemed whole on paper but hollow in experience. Globally, reactions were muted yet poignant. Economists in London and New York debated models that had failed to anticipate the extraction. Policymakers in Brussels and Washington noted that international capital could be both a blessing and a silent predator. In Asia, sovereign funds considered the fragility of interconnected markets, realizing that even distant systems were vulnerable to unseen financial currents. Yet amid the despair, a lesson emerged: wealth alone does not create security. Infrastructure, social programs, and human capital cannot thrive on paper profits that vanish as quickly as they arrive. The quiet truth crystallized for policymakers and citizens alike: resilience requires not just inflow, but retention and stewardship. Even as governments revised strategies and communities adapted, the question lingered: what had truly been lost, and what could still be reclaimed from a system designed to extract without leaving traces? As the dust settled, reflection became unavoidable. Entire regions had learned a painful lesson about the fragility of systems that depended on transient wealth. Money could arrive in abundance, flow through meticulous legal structures, and depart without leaving growth behind. The ghost company was gone, yet its impact lingered in unfinished roads, stalled hospitals, and the quiet uncertainty of citizens who once trusted in promised prosperity. Globally, the episode rippled quietly but persistently. Economists, policymakers, and investors carried the memory of hollow growth into future decisions. Across continents, institutions began to ask tougher questions. How much of the capital we celebrate truly belongs to the communities it touches? How can transparency and retention prevent invisible collapses from repeating elsewhere? The lingering truth was subtle yet profound. Systems could be designed to appear robust while quietly bleeding value. And in that realization lay both caution and hope. For nations, understanding the vulnerability of invisible wealth was the first step toward reclaiming control, grounding economies in reality rather than paper, and ensuring that prosperity, once promised, could finally endure. A question remained in the air: quiet, persistent, and urgent. When money vanishes, what remains? In the end, this story is more than numbers. Invisible systems can drain wealth, stall progress, and reshape lives across continents. Prosperity on paper does not guarantee real growth. The ghost company vanished, but its lessons remain. Resilience requires more than capital; it demands stewardship, transparency, and vigilance. When money disappears, the true measure of an economy is what remains for its people. In understanding these invisible flows, nations can reclaim control, protect communities, and ensure that future prosperity is anchored in reality, not just in fleeting numbers.